River of Doubt, Chapter 9, Warnings from the Dead. The oxen have given out, Kermit recorded in the cream-colored pages of his bound Letts of London journal on February 6, 1914. As drastic as Roosevelt's cutbacks in men and equipment had been, it had quickly become apparent that they were not enough. The expedition was faltering again. Not only were the oxen collapsing, the mules were dying at an alarming rate. Since Tapirapoan, the expedition had lost more than half of its 98 mules, and of those that remained, 10 could barely walk. If the men hoped to reach the banks of the River of Doubt, their only option was to make more sacrifices, gambling that the provisions and equipment that they abandoned now would not be desperately needed later on. Before the overland journey had even begun, Roosevelt had insisted that they leave behind half of the tents that the Brazilian government had given them as gifts in Tapirapoan, and which he later confided to the Royal Geographical Society's John Scott Kelty, were enormously heavy and utterly unsuited for the work. He now urged Rondon to get rid of half of the tents that remained. "I had to exercise real tact," he wrote Kelty, "because it almost broke the heart of good Colonel Rondon. Our companions cared immensely for what they regarded as splendor. 2 ox carts, groaning with the weight of their cargo, were abandoned, as were 2 trunks of specimens that Miller and Cherry had collected and preserved for the museum. The naturalists were even forced to part with most of their collecting equipment. Each man then cut his personal baggage in half, keeping," Roosevelt wrote, "only the sheer necessities. Kermit faithfully did his part to throw out what he did not absolutely need. He counted as necessities, however, his packet of letters from Belle, including a small picture of her that he always carried in his shirt pocket, and which he feared she would not recognize, what with it being wet through so many times, and his books, which were heavy but essential. Through all the lightening of the baggage, I have kept my books," he wrote Belle. "It means a lot to go to a quiet place to read the poems that we both like and those that I always associate with you." The poems were from the Oxford Book of French Verse. Besides this volume and the Oxford Book of English Verse, the rest of Kermit's books were written in Portuguese, with the notable exception of his copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were in the original Greek. As crucial as it was for the expedition to lighten the pack animals' loads, however, much of what they were carrying was not expendable. Before they began jettisoning crates of food and other critical supplies, Roosevelt, using all of his diplomatic skills so as not to offend his co-commander, questioned Rondon about the expedition's preparedness for the River of Doubt. If there was any possibility that they might not have all that they needed to make a safe descent, he told Rondon, they should walk, reserving every able-bodied animal for carrying provisions rather than passengers. Rondon would not have minded the walk at all from the physical standpoint, Roosevelt wrote, but he simply could not bear to have us take action which he regarded as an admission that we were not doing the thing in splendid style. He assured Roosevelt that there was no need to take such a drastic step. Everyone in the expedition would be well provided for on the River of Doubt. On February 8th, the American and Brazilian officers finally reached the Juruena River, the site of another of Rondon's remote and isolated telegraph stations. Pausing on a hilltop, the men looked back over the miles of rolling landscape that they had crossed, shrouded in low, thick forest. Farther north, the 600-mile-long Juruena widened significantly, but even here, in its relatively narrow southern reaches, it was broad and deep enough to force the mules to cross it on a rickety raft composed of a wooden platform lashed onto 3 dugout canoes. When they reached the other side, pulling themselves across the rushing current with a wire trolley, the men were, as always, relieved to stop at a telegraph station. Their accommodations would again be a simple wattle and daub hut, with a thatched roof and plenty of cracks and chinks for the sandflies to find their way inside and torment them throughout the night. But it was better than spending another miserable night in rain-soaked tents. As it had in Utiarity, however, bad news awaited the expedition in Juruena. This time it was about Fiala. From a telegram that was handed to Roosevelt, the men learned that the first day of their friend's descent of the Papagaio River had nearly been his last. Fiala's expedition, which had begun just the day before without any of the provisions he had packed for Roosevelt's journey, had met with immediate and almost complete disaster. Not long after they had launched their 3 dugout canoes, 2 of them, including the one in which Fiala was riding, were sucked into a churning pocket of the river known as the Rapids of the Devil. Most of the 9 men had managed to fight their way back to the bank, but Fiala, along with half of the expedition's food and most of its equipment, was swept helplessly down the river. I just saved myself by snatching hold of a tree bough that overhung the stream about 30 feet from the bank, and then pulling myself in, Fiala told a reporter for the New York Times after returning home. The Brazilians whom Rondon had assigned to accompany Fiala, however, told their colonel a very different story. It was true that the boats had capsized, they said, but Fiala did not save himself. In fact, he very nearly caused the drowning death of the man who ultimately rescued him from the rapids. Even if Fiala had once again led his men into a disaster with new doubts about his own actions, the ill-starred explorer had at least been proved right on one count: his insistence that North American canoes were the proper means for descending the Amazon's dangerous tributaries. Fiala blamed his near death in the Papagayo Rapids on the heavy, clumsy South American dugouts. After his first disastrous day on the Papagayo, Fiala refused to trust the dugouts a second time. He returned to Utiarity and retrieved the Canadian canoes that he himself had handpicked, and which Roosevelt's expedition had left behind because they could not afford the additional weight. The Brazilians on his team thought that their commander had lost his mind and balked at the idea of boarding such an insubstantial-looking canoe, especially since Rondon held them responsible for Fiala's safety. However, when they saw how buoyantly the canoe rode the rapids, Fiala later proudly recalled, how a twist of the paddle would deflect it around a rock on which a dugout would crash and smash, they gave cries of delight. Fiala's selection of his Canadian canoes had been vindicated. Miles away on his journey to the River of Doubt, however, Roosevelt had no way to know that and could do nothing about it even if he had. Outside of Juruena, moreover, the men's concern about accidental mishaps, dying mules, and low supplies were compounded by a new fear: calculated attack. The hum of the telegraph wires, as familiar now as the weary clop, clop, clop of their mules' hooves on the wet clay and sand soil, was the only sign of civilization in the broad scrub forest before them. They felt as isolated as if they were traveling across an uninhabited planet. They were not alone, however, and they knew that there was rarely a moment of the day or night when they were not being watched. They were now, Roosevelt wrote, in a still wilder region, the land of the naked Nambiquaras. Rondon had made his first contact with this tribe, one of the most isolated and primitive of the Amazon, only 6 years earlier. They had welcomed him with a fusillade of poison-tipped arrows. Hoping to make a clear gesture of friendship, Rondon and just 3 of his men, including Lyra, had ridden single file towards a Nambiquara camp, their mules heaped high with gifts. But before they had even reached the camp, Rondon had felt something fly past his face that was so light and fast that for a moment he thought it was a bird. In the millisecond it took him to realize that it was an arrow, a second one slammed into his helmet. The third arrow struck his chest and lodged in his thick leather bandolier. Ordering his men not to return fire, Rondon calmly turned his mule around and rode back to his own camp, sitting straight in his saddle with the arrow, 5 feet long, with a 10-inch macaw feather, split in 2 on one end and a serrated cuirass-coated tip on the other, still sticking out of his chest. For weeks the Nambiquara had terrorized Rondon's men, disappearing during the day and attacking at night when the soldiers were most vulnerable. The men were so frightened that they refused even to build a campfire after the sun went down, in the hope that the Nambiquara would not be able to find them on the Black Plateau. Gradually, however, Rondon had won the Indians over, by first wooing them with gifts and then luring them to his campsite by playing a phonograph at night, sending the strains of a Wagnerian opera into the forest like a beautiful incorporeal siren. Through persistent kindness, compassion, and patience in the face of relentless and often deadly attacks, he had forged a simple peace. But it was tentative at best, and had met with varying degrees of success within the tribe's scattered and independent bands. For the telegraph station workers, the men whom Rondon left behind to guard and repair the poles after the rest of the expedition had moved on, the Nhambiquara remained a constant threat. In general, long-term peace between the telegraph station workers and the Indians was rare. Although the relationship usually started out on a friendly footing, Rondon having ordered the workers to be kind to the Indians, not meddle in their affairs, and give them plenty of gifts, it almost always devolved into resentment and distrust. The telegraph station workers, moreover, were utterly alone with no hope of help from any quarter, and with a store of coveted weapons and metal tools that made them enticing targets. In the late 1930s, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss traveled along Rondon's telegraph line and heard many stories of telegraph workers who had died grisly deaths at the hands of the Nhambiquara. Someone may recall, Lévi-Strauss wrote in his seminal book Tres Tropiques, how a certain telegraph operator was found buried up to the waist with his chest riddled with arrows and his Morse key on his head. Even missionaries, who were ostensibly there to help the Indians, body and soul, had difficulty staying alive in Nhambiquara territory. The seemingly simplest of misunderstandings could lead to the slaughter of an entire missionary community. Lévi-Strauss told the story of one such massacre that happened in the very region through which Roosevelt and his men were now traveling. A Protestant mission came to settle not far from the post at Juruena. It would seem that relations soon became embittered, the natives having been dissatisfied with the gifts, inadequate apparently, that the missionaries had given them in return for their help in building the house and planting the garden. A few months later, an Indian with a high temperature presented himself at the mission and was publicly given 2 aspirin tablets, which he swallowed. Afterwards, he bathed in the river, developed congestion of the lungs, and died. As the Nhambiquara are expert poisoners, they concluded that their fellow tribesmen had been murdered. They launched a retaliatory attack during which 6 members of the mission were massacred, including a 2-year-old child. Only 1 woman was found alive by a search party sent out from Cuiabá. Even where relationships appeared to be well established, there was still a good chance that things could go disastrously wrong. Rondon did his best to civilize the Indians who lived near his telegraph stations, a perhaps misguided effort for which he would be criticized in later years, but he did not control them, and he never would. Inuit he taught the Parichi Indians, one of the region's most sophisticated and peaceful tribes, how to build more substantial houses. He helped them grow potatoes, corn, and manioc, and he gave them clothing. He even hired some of them to work for the Rondon Commission, paying the average worker 66 cents a day, particularly valuable employees $1 and chiefs $1.66. The Nhambiquara, however, had proved impervious to Rondon's efforts. They were still largely nomadic hunter-gatherers, settling down only during the rainy season. For most of the year, they slept under the most temporary and fragile of shelters, a half or quarter circle of palm branches that they had driven into holes dug into the sand. They would set up these shelters in the direction from which they expected to receive the most sun, wind, or rain, but they would disassemble them every morning and build new ones the next night. Unlike neighboring tribes, the Nhambiquara also slept on the ground rather than in a hammock, a practice for which the Parichi despised them. The Nhambiquara were also wholly uninterested in clothing. Some of the Parichi who worked for the telegraph stations had begun to wear shirts and even pants, but the Nhambiquara men still wore nothing more than a string around their waist with, at the most, a tuft of dried grass or a scrap of cloth that served no purpose beyond pure ornamentation. The Nhambiquara woman did not even wear that much. This determined nakedness never ceased to worry Rondon, who did not trust his soldiers around the Indian girls, and who knew that if his men succumbed to this particular temptation, they would likely pay for it with their lives. An even greater danger to the telegraph line soldiers and to all the progress that Rondon had made in his relationship with the Indians was tribal warfare. Rondon had strictly forbidden his men ever to take sides in a tribal battle, no matter how seemingly brutal or unjust. In Utiarity, however, one man had recently defied this order with potentially disastrous results. Shortly before the expedition had arrived there, a group of Nhambiquara had descended on the Parichis' village while the men were gone. Hearing the screams of their wives and mothers, the Parichi had rushed home, and a battle had broken out in full view of the telegraph station. The Nhambiquara were better, more experienced warriors than the Parichi, but the Parichi had a powerful ally, a telegraph line employee, the only man for nearly 100 miles, who had a gun. Having grown fond of the Parichi and having watched the Nhambiquara prey on them time and again, the man had stepped into the melee, raised his gun, and fatally shot a Nhambiquara warrior, enraging Rondon and putting at risk the precarious peace he had worked so long to achieve. Rondon's injunction against violence directed toward an Indian, any Indian, for any reason, was categorical. In fact, he valued the lives of the Amazonian Indians above his own life, or the lives of his men. Surely there was not a soldier in the Rondon Commission who could not recite by heart his colonel's now famous command, "Die if you must, but never kill." Rondon's success in the Amazon had depended on this dictum. It was the only reason the Indians had ever dared to trust him. As they had in the United States, Native Americans in Brazil had been exploited, enslaved, and slaughtered for centuries. Since 1500, the year the Portuguese explorer Pedro Alvares Cabral is said to have discovered the region. In 1908, Hermann von Eyhering, the German-born director of the Sao Paulo Museum, argued that it was a shame, but the Indians would surely not survive Brazilian ambitions, and they should not be allowed to stand in their way. "I feel for them as a man," he wrote, "but as a citizen in keeping with my political belief, I cannot stand by and watch the march of our culture halted by Indian arrows. And certainly the life of the backwoodsman and colonist is worth more to us than the life of the savage. The fate of the Indians is certain. Many of them will accept our culture, the remainder will continue to be our enemies, and, as such, will gradually disappear." Unwittingly, however, von Eyhering had ignited the greatest advancement in the cause of Indian rights that Brazil had ever witnessed. Outraged by the museum director's blatant disregard for Indian lives, von Eyhering had even gone so far as to note in an article that it was worth registering here what the American General Custer said: "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Rondon engaged him in a public debate. In 1910, the momentum generated by this debate resulted in the formation of Brazil's Indian Protection Service, the SPI, the country's first agency devoted to the protection of its native inhabitants, and Rondon was named its first director. Rondon's brave and unyielding advocacy of the Amazonian Indian was to become his most important legacy, outshining even his achievements as an explorer. Whatever the merits of his philosophy, however, his approach was cold comfort to the soldiers he forced to practice it. In fact, so infamous were Rondon's expeditions into the interior that he had to pay his men 7 times what they made anywhere else. Even the cook aboard the Nioic had known Rondon's reputation for losing his men's lives as he forged a path through Indian territory. When the Brazilian colonel invited him to join the descent of the River of Doubt, the cook had replied in horror, "Sir, I've done nothing to deserve such punishment." Rondon refused even to let his men retaliate when they had been attacked. It was not unusual for his soldiers to have to watch helplessly while their friends died brutal deaths at the hands of Indians, and then have no ability to avenge their loss, no recourse but tears. "Let us weep," Rondon would tell them, "for I love this man who has perished for my sake, but I command you to do as he did, never shoot." Rondon believed that his mission in protecting and pacifying the Indians was larger than his own life, larger than any of their lives. He would rather die than surrender his ideals, and he obliged his men to follow suit. Roosevelt, for his part, was not planning on sacrificing his expedition or the lives of any of his men on the altar of Rondon's ideals. As a young rancher in the Dakota Territory, Roosevelt had barked, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. By the time he became president, his views had tempered, and he, like Rondon, believed that the country's aim should be the Indians' ultimate absorption into the body of our people. However, the man he appointed as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Francis Loup, made no effort to hide his belief that Indians would never be seamlessly integrated into the world of the white man. In fact, he argued that Indians should not be made United States citizens. They are not fitted for citizenship's duties, he declared, or able to take advantage of its benefits. Roosevelt would never completely shake off the model of the American Western frontier with which he had grown up. When he was in Dakota, the battles between the Indians and the pioneers were only just ending. There were still sporadic outbreaks here and there, and occasionally bands of marauding young braves were a menace to outlying and lonely settlements, he recalled, but many of the white men were themselves lawless and brutal, and prone to commit outrages on the Indians. Though Roosevelt had sympathy for the Indians and understood the injustices and cruelties that they had endured in South America as well as North America, Rondon's passive approach was alien to his entire way of thinking. He was much more inclined to conquer than to be slaughtered. The stakes were rising, moreover, because with each passing day the expedition was intruding deeper into Nhambiquara territory, and the Indians were becoming increasingly bold with Roosevelt and his men. Their gestures were friendly, as they clearly knew and liked Rondon, but the expedition members understood that the slightest insult or injury, whether real or simply perceived, could turn the Indians against them before they even realized what had happened. The Nhambiquara lived by the laws of the wilderness, which demanded that, as Roosevelt explained, friends proclaim their presence. A silent advance marks a foe. During war, the Nhambiquara had perfected the art of the surprise attack. When preparing for a war, the chief of the band takes the men into the woods and tells them that there are bad people to the north which they must kill, observed Calvera Oberg, a Smithsonian anthropologist who studied the tribe in the mid-1940s. Then, after singing a war song, they set about making many arrows and war clubs. The night before the attack, they camp near the village of the enemy. The men paint their bodies with the sap of some latex tree and their faces with uruku and charcoal. They then take leaves and stuff them into any holes in the ground or in trees around their camp. After all the holes are stopped up, they take the skin of an anteater, the skin of a toad, and the leaves of a tree, which are used in preventing rain, and burn them. The stopping of the holes is believed to prevent the enemy from hearing them. The chief remains at his spot and sings all night with the shamans. At dawn, the young men approach the huts of the enemy, stand in the doorway, and shout. And when the occupants awaken, they are shot down or clubbed. No one is spared. Conversely, to show their good intentions when they visited the expedition, the Indians would leave their weapons behind and call out to Roosevelt and his men from hiding places in the forest that surrounded the telegraph road. The members of the expedition would answer, inviting the Indians to visit their camp. The Indians would then shout again. The expedition would answer, shout, answer, until finally the Indians were certain that they were welcome, and the expedition was certain that they were coming as friends and not as attackers. Once in the camp, the Nhambiquara would get as close as physically possible to the white men, whom they found curiously pale, tall, and hairy. While Roosevelt was trying to write, they would gather around him so tightly that he would have to gently push them away so that he could move his arms. The Nhambiquara were taller and darker than the Parichi, with longer heads and hair cut into distinctive bowl-like bangs. Around Rondon, they were smiling and relaxed. Kermit liked them. They are a very pleasant set, he wrote to Bell, and didn't look at all as if they had given Rondon all the trouble they have. They have small hands and feet and really nice faces. It's melancholy to think how they will change when civilization comes here. Leo Miller, however, who perhaps of all the members of the expedition had the lowest opinion of Indians, was repelled by the quills and thin pieces of bamboo that the Nhambiquara men threaded through holes pierced into their upper lips and the septum of their noses, especially since the Indians clearly had no appreciation for the American concept of personal space. They had the unpleasant habit of coming close up to one and jabbering at a furious rate of speed, Miller wrote. This caused the labrettes to move uncomfortably near one's eyes, and it was necessary at times to retreat a short distance in order to get out of range of the menacing ornaments. Roosevelt marveled that these sticks, which were roughly 6 inches long, did not bother the Indians even when they ate. They laughed at the suggestion of removing them, he wrote. Evidently, to have done so would have been rather bad manners, like using a knife as an aid in eating ice cream. The Nhambiquara intrigued Roosevelt, and he enjoyed their company, but he would not let his guard down around them. He had heard vivid tales of their brutality towards the Parichi and Utiarity, and he had spent a night watching them dance in Urena, only to wake up and find that they had left in the wee hours, taking with them 2 of the expedition's dogs. These Indians were, he wrote, light-hearted robbers and murderers. While he was on the expedition, Roosevelt felt obliged to follow Rondon's lead. This was his country and his territory, and Roosevelt respected Rondon's authority as a colonel in the Brazilian military. However, nothing he saw suggested that Rondon's approach would produce anything but tragedy. His concerns were dramatically illustrated on February 11th when the men made camp near the remains of an abandoned Indian village. After dinner, a few of the men wandered over to see what was left. Not far from the sagging and crumbling palm thatch huts, the men stumbled upon the graves of 2 Brazilian soldiers and an army officer who had been murdered by Nhambiquara and then buried vertically, with their heads and shoulders sticking out of the ground. The most frightening aspect of these lonely graves was that the Indians who had killed these men were much further along the road of pacification, civilization, and friendship with the outside world than were the unknown Indians who lived on the banks of the River of Doubt. The Nhambiquara were violent and unpredictable, but at least they had forged a semblance of peace with Rondon. The Indians of the River of Doubt, in contrast, were utterly unknown even to Rondon, and there was no reason to think that they would welcome the expedition into their territory with any more tolerance or self-restraint than the Nhambiquara had shown when they had rained arrows down on Rondon at his first approach. Roosevelt and his men may have regarded themselves as explorers, but the Indians would know them only as invaders. With all of these worries weighing on his mind, Roosevelt was struck one last heavy blow just as he reached the River of Doubt. Throughout the overland journey, Rondon had assured the ex-president that the expedition would have enough provisions for every man who was to descend the river. When they took stock of their supplies, however, Rondon and Roosevelt together learned that the haphazard preparations for the journey and the grueling month since leaving Tapirapoan had taken a far greater toll than anyone had fully realized. Even in the best of circumstances, the remaining rations would not come close to feeding the 16 camaradas who were to do the hardest work of paddling the expedition's boats and portaging its equipment. At the very outset of their descent of an unmapped river, Roosevelt was forced to cut his own and the other officers' rations in half so that the camaradas on whom they depended could have any chance of surviving the journey. The expedition had now turned into a race against time. The survival of every man would depend on their collective ability to master the churning river, evade its ever-present dangers, and discover a route out of the deepest rain forest before their supplies ran out.